Professor Holsinger, Professor Whipple, ladies and gentlemen, I could not have had a more generous introduction. All I can say in return is that having stayed one day longer on the campus of UVA, when I say it is a delight and honor, I'm one day more sincere. Now, in my last lecture, I began with an analysis of the imaginative background to the sayings of Jesus, in which he urged first the rich young man and then his disciples to gain treasure in heaven. Sell your possessions and give alms. Provide yourselves with purses that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. I then continued by pointing out that in the early churches, these particular sayings never stood alone. They served, as it were, as a flagship metaphor for many forms of giving, both to the poor and to various kinds of leaders and administrators in the church. In effect, the stream of giving was split. Paul had raised money for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem in response to the request that they would have us remember the poor. But Paul's activities already raised the further question of who exactly these poor might be. Were they simply the economic poor, or were they also the holy poor, leaders of the Christian community who as travelers, organizers, and teachers depended for their living on funds provided by the labor of others? Furthermore, what I would call the structural logic of the Christian communities made it increasingly necessary to ensure that both streams of giving flowed abundantly. The poor were to be remembered, and those who ministered to them were to be paid. This was because the distribution of alms to the poor had to take place in a manner that did not compromise the fiercely countercultural nature of the Christian community. Alms must not become direct gifts that place the poor under an obligation to the rich, nor should gifts to the clergy turn them into the clients of their donors. As says Schwartz has made clear in his study of Judaism at this time, his recent book, Whether Jews a Mediterranean Society, Reciprocity and Solidarity in Ancient Judaism, as Schwartz makes plain, Christian clergy and Jewish rabbis shared the same preoccupation. This was to guard the precious countercultural quality of their religious organization. And in order to do this, both had to find ways to create, in Schwartz's words, a type of redistribution intentionally set up so as to hinder the proliferation of personal ties of dependency. Now, for this reason, both look back to the example of the Levites, to a body of priests who in ancient Israel owned no land and so were dependent for their living on the offerings of the faithful. In the Christian churches, a powerful social logic ensured that the leaders of the community came to be treated as strictly homologous to the poor. Like the Levites, the Christian clergy, along with other kind of Christian militant leaders, emerged, in Schwartz's words, as a class of functionaries or enablers suspended between privilege and pauperdom. The lesson of the 3rd century was that this formula worked. We saw in our last lecture the remarkable network of charity set in place, for example, by the Roman Christian community in the middle of the 3rd century, the support of some 1,500 poor persons, along with salaries for large numbers of clergymen. Altogether, the pooling of funds for the poor in the hands of the bishops and clergy gave impressive financial muscle to local Christian leaders. Yet, as we saw, almsgiving and other forms of outreach to the distressed was not the only financial challenge that the Christian communities had to meet. Christian teachers also had to be set free to satisfy a widespread hunger for religious instruction. We often fail to understand the strength of this current. This, I think, is because we tend to be committed to an impoverished view of the complexity of Roman society in this time, and of the speed and range with which new ideas could circulate. In our accounts of the social structure of the early Christian communities and of their relationship to Roman society as a whole, I think we've tended to suffer from what Walter Scheidel, a leading social historian of the Roman Empire, has called binary tunnel vision. We see only a world rigidly divided between the leisured classes and the abject poor. As a result, we miss the sheer zest with which wide sections of Roman society, well below the level of the elites, threw themselves into the business of making sense of their world in religious terms. Christians shared this zest to a very marked degree. 3rd century papyri from Egypt, now interpreted by Anne-Marie Lauwendijk in her book Greetings in the Lord, Early Christians and the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, show that Christians took their catechesis very seriously. Bishops wrote personal letters introducing catechumens who traveled in search of oikodomie, of spiritual edification. These catechumens were categorized according to the books of the Bible, which they were in the process of mastering. Some were on Genesis, some were on the Gospel of St. John. As a result, every major Christian community had its own little think tank. And the greatest think tank of all, of course, was that which had gravitated around the mighty scholar Origen. From 234 to his death in 254, the great Origen taught at Caesarea Maritima in Palestine. Origen collected a stupendous library. In the words of Tony Grafton and Megan Williams in their recent study, Christianity and the Transformation of the Book, this library was one of the greatest single monuments of Roman scholarship. Though Origen had originally been aided by individual patrons, his library came to be funded from the wealth of the Church of Caesarea. Origen was therefore an outstanding example of a kalkenteros, a brazen-boweled super nerd, set free to study and to teach by the labors of others. But there was one further need, and that was the thirst for contact with persons touched by the hand of God, for holy men and holy women. As the career of the disreputable cynic Peregrinus showed, potential martyrs in prison, the confessores, received the same reverence from Christian congregations as holy men and women would in later times. Deeply suspicious of fly-by-night prophets, the Didascalia Apostolorum of around 220 AD urged local Christians to spare no pains in visiting and feeding the confessors of the faith, potential martyrs, when in prison. Let them be esteemed by you as God upon earth, for through them you see the Lord our Saviour. And so my lecture today will be about those to whom Christians of the 3rd and 4th centuries looked to find God on earth, and to the very different, often disturbingly radical manner in which these holy persons drew sustenance and financial support from the labor of those to whom they ministered. To do this, we will go to a very distinctive part of the world. We will look at two distinctive but comparable groups. We will go to where the Fertile Crescent joined Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean in a great northern arch which stretched from southern Iraq through Syria to Antioch and the Mediterranean coast. In the words of John Ward Perkins, speaking of the art and architecture of the region in Roman and late Roman times, I cite, the frontier territory between Rome and Parthia, the Persian Empire, was neither a cultural barrier nor a mere gateway and point of passage between East and West. It was a vital creative center in its own right. And it was this fact above all which enabled it to serve as an effective intermediary between the two great civilizations which flourished on its borders.